When I say that the future is going to be led by artists, what I mean is we don't have the same pressures and stresses that I think lead to virtue in young men. He said the end of the Faustian West was largely because we've discovered everything in the world. There is no more colonies. It seems to me that Nietzsche is attempting to, on a very biological level, virtue was a necessity to be able to live successfully in such a dangerous and violent world originally, especially if we go back.
Okay, joining us on the show today, Patrick, the Warrior Philosopher on YouTube, a young aristocrat who's just written an awesome dystopian novel called Prometheus Dreams. And yeah, what to say about him? We're going to be probably talking about Mishima and weightlifting and Nietzsche, what it is to be a modern aristocrat in our decadent times. So, Patrick, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I've been following your stuff for a while on YouTube. It's a lot of fun, and you seem like a thoughtful young man. Obviously, good Irish name. You're joining us for Boston, right?
Yes, sir.
I want to find out a bit about your life. How did you get interested in the work you do now?
Yeah, so growing up, I did martial arts. I was looking for some sort of challenge, as I think a lot of young men are today. And for martial arts, I think there's a natural orientation towards some of the more martial ideologies and philosophies. So after high school, instead of going to college like everybody else in my school, I actually went to an all boys Catholic school, an all boys
Oh,
Jesuit school. And it was very preppy. And of course, they expected everyone to go to college and sort of fit this very specific path. And I said, instead, I'm going to join the Marine Corps. So I was in the Marine Corps for 5 years. I got to travel a good bit in Asia. I got to go to, I think, a total of 6 different countries on one deployment and then one exercise. And during that time is when I was exposed to the philosophy of Nietzsche, Mishima, all these different guys. And I think largely it's in large part because of all the people I was exposed to. We all had this similar sort of will towards the martial philosophies, being in the military. And, just from making friends, I got exposed to all these different thinkers. And here we are today. And lucky enough to have been exposed to them and had all those great experiences in the military.
I saw a reel of you hitting pads on the ocean on a boat. It looked
That's
like
right. That
fun.
was one of my deployments.
A lot of testosterone, I imagine, as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that was so much fun.
interesting. So, what is the main thing you do now?
So now I'm in college. I got done with the military back in September. Uh, so I started my semester up in school. Right now I'm on my spring break and I'm just visiting family here in Boston. But I go to school now. I'm trying to work on my writing. Obviously, I put out my first book recently. So with school writing and then just trying to keep up the content so that we can herald in a new cultural renaissance. I think that hopefully can bring a new light to young men and restore that masculinity that we need.
Let's start there then. Why do we? I think I'm in agreement with you, by the way. But why do we need a new cultural renaissance?
I think that largely with the abundance of modernity, we don't have the same pressures and stresses that I think lead to virtue in young men. I think that one of the best films, and it may sound like a bit of a cliche, but it always rings true, is Fight Club. And there is that speech, of course, where Tyler Durden's addressing all the members of Fight Club. And he says, we have no great war, no great depression. Our great war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives. And throughout most of human history, just basic survival was almost a meaning inserted into life. Everything was richer and tasted better because of how difficult it was to attain. And, in large part, that's kind of what my book talks about as well. It's sort of this struggle of, in the absence of pain and in the abundance of just this sort of mind numbing pleasure, that we don't really experience euphoria. And I think what a cultural renaissance can and needs to, and, I believe will do, is if our lives do not have the necessary stresses to become virtuous, then we have to self impose them upon ourselves. We have to simulate suffering and pain. And I think the gym, martial arts, maybe going to join the military are all great ways for young men to purposefully seek those stressors that are going to make them better men. So we need this renaissance so that we can truly live life in such a way where we truly experience euphoria. Because frankly, in modernity, these cheap pleasures that are easily afforded to us, just to me, are not really euphoric. They're just
Right, right.
cheap, mind numbing things.
Okay, lots said there. So first of all, for listeners,
Yeah.
I did a video on the 5 philosophies of Fight Club that people can check out on the YouTube channel. They won't have heard it if they're just listening on the podcast. They can check that out. You also talked about virtue. Now, I taught a class today on human flourishing for about 50 different coaches this morning. And, this Greek idea of human flourishing is not just pleasure, but also includes the idea of a meaningful life and a virtuous life. These were not separate to the Greeks. And this was almost confusing to people. I was saying, how do you develop your virtue? Because I said, if you don't have a way to develop your virtue, you won't have any. It's as simple as that. The culture's not going to give you virtue. It's going to give you, as you say, sort of cheap thrills and hedonism and addiction, because that's desirable for the economic system. So how would you explain, like, even from scratch, the idea of virtue? Because maybe it's common sense to us or people in the military, but I think it's almost an anathema idea in this day and age.
Yeah. So if we're going to go back to the Greeks specifically, of course they have, I think, probably two of their most important principles were arete and andrea. So arete being excellence and andrea being manliness. And on a very biological level, virtue was a necessity to be able to live successfully in such a dangerous and violent world originally, especially if we go back even before the city state, right? Without walls, your virtue is your wall, your virtue is your armor. It's what keeps you alive. It's what makes you strong enough to survive in the chaotic state of nature. So to me, what virtue is, and how we might try to understand it through a modern lens, is at base, it is these things that make us more successful in basic survival situations. But beyond that, our bodies were never meant to feel satisfied in abundance, obviously. We were never meant to be satisfied because of how difficult life was for such a long time. So we say, well, we don't need virtue anymore. We don't need manliness, right? Life is easy. But this is also an illusion. I mean, you look at the world's at war right now. You have Ukraine, you have, Gaza was just at war. People are fighting every day. It's just not in our little
Yeah,
bubble. So
Congo,
you say,
Sudan, it's many places. Yeah.
precisely. So we don't see the necessities for virtue. We don't see the necessities for Andrea and Arete because it's so far removed from us. But at a snap of the fingers, we could be right back there. And when that time comes, it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in war, right?
Yes, yes, I've been literally a gardener and I've been in war zones, so I could definitely, literally, I could tell you that is the case. And I was on the ground in Ukraine during week 3 after the full-scale
Wow.
invasion, and I can tell you, people very quickly were requesting manly virtue. The people there, my friends who are sort of, modern, postmodern, feminists, modern young women, as you would expect, and very cool, very educated women, they absolutely were saying, no, we need manly virtue. And I even saw this the other day. I was in a discussion group and a drunk guy came in and he was kind of being aggressive. And then he left. And the women in the group immediately said, will you protect us if he comes again? We want your manly virtue. And I was like, oh, all of a sudden the manly virtue is wanted. So it's amazing in these situations how quickly manly virtue, which might sound sexist or old fashioned to listeners, but that is still the reality. And we are that close to it at any moment, needing that.
Oh yeah.
Mm.
On that topic, I think a funny little story recently. So my lady is at home with our dogs. I'm not there right now because I'm on vacation, and we have this one dog who's very aggressive. He's kind of, he's a bit of a dickhead, but she always complains about how aggressive he is until at night she hears some sound outside and she's a little scared or something, and all of a sudden this is the best dog ever,
Right.
because ultimately, yeah, I mean, it comes down to that. Actually, there's a great, so you're probably familiar with Uber Boyo.
Yeah, great guy, Irish,
Yeah,
Nietzsche,
yeah,
and I'd love to talk to him on the show actually, if you know him. Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Maybe we'll set that up. I had him on my podcast last week, or I think we recorded it 2 weeks ago, whatever. Anyway, recently, and we were actually talking about something very similar to this, where they had this test where they find that people's uh, ideological orientations will shift based on their ability to sense threats. So when you're able to sense threats at a higher level, you're going to naturally be more drawn to, for example, needing or wanting these masculine virtues around you, because you realize the masculine virtue, in a very distilled form, is, like I said, it's that wall that's going to protect you from all these threats on the outside. And I think the more that we get separated from threats and we get separated from real, raw life, we forget that these are necessary. So it sort of all goes into what we're talking about here.
Right. And that's not just violence, because people might say, yeah, but it's men doing the violence. It tends to be men who are violent, at least physically, though
Mhm.
women are just as aggressive, the studies show, if not more aggressive, but less physically. But let's say,
Right.
okay, so it's not violence, but it's also, I don't know, the electricity that's lighting me up right now and allowing us to have this cool, like most of the guys who are producing the electricity in the power stations of the UK, in the oil rigs in the North Sea, most of those people are men. Not all, there are
Right.
exceptions, but 95, if you go to an oil rig, it's tough Scottish guys with tattoos. Okay. They have
Yeah.
plenty of masculine virtue to work on a fucking North Sea oil rig, or like my granddad, a fisherman in the Irish Sea. You eat your fish and chips in England and you think, oh, there's no manly virtue here. But you try being on a fishing boat in the Irish Sea. You try it, right? That cod is coming from manly virtue. Even the potatoes. I used to work on farms, and potato farming is tough work. Even with machines now, it's still tough work. Fish and chips is coming from manly virtue, man. So even on these like silly examples, it's still there. It's a
Yeah.
luxury belief to pretend it's not, as Rob Henderson says, right?
No, absolutely. My heart goes out to your grandfather, because I know that I remember when I was on a boat, you know, the swells we had were nothing compared to. So the boat I was on also goes to Alaska, and there
Right.
was one day where I think we had 10-foot swells, and I was like, "This is horrible." I was on my little chair flying across,
Yeah.
my workspace, and they were like, "Oh, it could get 3 times as bad as this in Alaska." I was like, "What?" Like, geez, we're not fishing,
That's a
Imagine
big
you're
boat
getting
too, right?
lines.
You're in a much bigger boat. Yeah.
Exactly, much
Yeah.
bigger, so you don't feel it as much. So I can resonate with that. It must be tough work.
Yeah. I mean, he actually stopped being a fisherman to fight in the war and said it was easier in many ways. But, it's,
that's
it's World
that's
War
that's a
Two.
pretty badass line.
So yeah, it's good. The other granddad was in airplanes on D-Day, fighting on D-Day in airplanes.
Wow.
So it's one was on the water, one was in the air. So I try and stay on the fucking ground, man. I try and stay away from those two places if I can. But
Oh
okay,
yeah,
so how is this relevant? It's all macho, it's all good fun. We could talk about
sure.
Nietzsche and masculinity and slave morality, and and people might be clutching their pearls listening to this already. But how is this relevant to just like, most of the young guys I know, they smoke weed, they watch porn, they vape. They're, if not mentally ill, they're borderline mentally ill. They're highly
Right.
anxious. This is the average kind of doomer bro today. So,
Mhm.
how can this kind of philosophy help them? Then they're not in the Marine Corps, perhaps.
Yeah, I think first of all, the Nietzsche says amor fati, right? You must love your fate, and of course this this can be interpreted lots of ways, but as simple as the spiritual neurosis of the time we live in today, right? You have to learn to. You can't just say, "Oh, things would be better if this was 100 years ago." Things were better, 100 years ago, and of course, it's not necessarily better in all ways. But in that one specific area where you want purpose and meaning, you think, "Well, it was better in the past." You can't live in the past in the present either, right? You have to accept the modern world for what it is,
Right,
and
there's a lot
then
of
and
cosplay,
then
right? Like pretending you're a knight
yeah,
is very, crusading knight
LARPing,
or
yeah,
samurai. As my Japanese friend, they're
right.
into like Mishima pretending he's a samurai. It's like, hey man, things have moved on. Like we also need to accept the reality we're in.
Sure. Well, even with Mishima, right? To an extent, you could say, well, it was a bit of a LARP, right? Not to mention though, Mishima was specifically a member of a samurai lineage.
Okay.
So if only things were different, maybe he would have been a samurai
Do you want to
still.
say what a
But
do you want to say what a LARP is? Because some listeners might not know
oh
what a LARP
yeah,
is.
right. So live action role play. So for example, it's this idea that a lot of people, instead of dealing with the present, they'll be like, well, things were better 1,000 years ago when we were all Vikings. I'm a modern day
They'll
Viking.
dress
And
up as a Viking, or I see people in Britain doing this. They dress up like it's the
yeah,
1950s, and they put bunting up. And I'm like, guys, you're just
right.
laughing. It's not the 50s anymore, So
Yeah. And I'm not a bit, and just to throw it out there, I don't necessarily hate on LARPing to a certain degree. I think
yeah,
to a certain degree it's good fun.
for its place.
But of course, yeah, but of course, you gotta also adapt to modernity, right? You can't get stuck in the past. And even going back to Mishima, um, his mod, he trained in the Japanese Defense Forces, right? He was out there shooting guns as well, not just swinging swords. So I just want to point that out there. I think Mishima was fusing the necessities of modernity and also holding the past sacred. But in terms of what Nietzschean philosophy, I think, can do for the modern man is, because we're not in the past, because we're in the situation we are now, it's the ultimate. You hear the black pill, like, oh, it's all over, everything's doomed, whatever, right? It's very easy to fall into that abyss. But what Nietzschean philosophy is essentially saying is that, well, the black pill, this age where the metaphorical God is dead, and we've lost all these thousands of years of moral philosophy to this sort of new moral relativism. It seems like this very scary and dooming thing, but what Nietzsche is saying, well, it's actually an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for us to reevaluate
Yes.
all our morals and essentially insert new morals that could potentially make us even more beautiful than the past. So it's the ultimate futurist philosophy, in the sense that Nietzsche in Human All Human talks about metaphysics as a building block, right? There's value in this traditionalism, but what we want to do is go beyond that, right? And I think it's a very beautiful and inspiring message to young men, is that though this time is bad and perhaps it seems worse in some ways to the past, this is actually an opportunity for you to create institutions and perhaps empires and polities even greater than the ones that you are currently mourning over. You're mourning over perhaps the fall of the British Empire. Well, you can make something better than that. It's like the whole Spenglerian decline of the West. Just because this West is dead
Right,
does not mean
right.
another one
Yeah, I
can't
mean,
come
Rome
around.
fell, but Byzantium lasted another 1,000 years after the Western Roman
Right.
Empire fell and had its own glory. And I mean, British Empire 2.0 is going to be fucking amazing, man. It's going to be the shit. Let me tell you,
Yes,
it's
sir.
going to be awesome on the moon and stuff. Yeah, I'm with you on the LARPing. So for listeners, a quick sort of recap here that Nietzsche came along, and there was a lot of the values of pre-modernity were essentially religious. They came from various kind of religious traditions. It was, whatever faith was there. But then science, rationality, evolution came along and said, hey, actually, God is dead. And Nietzsche wasn't celebrating that. He was saying this is a problem, that God is dead. And he was saying, what do we do now? And his answer was, he wasn't a nihilist. He was saying, let's create our own values. I never quite understood that. How do we create our own values? Because surely it takes values to create our own values. What's your take on that?
So I would point to his project of Will to Power, which was never finished, and of course his sister ends up completing the book with different essays, various essays from his life. But originally, the project of Will to Power by Nietzsche was attempting to transvalue all morals and provide a more codified doctrine of how we were going to deal with this death of God. And I've had many conversations with various friends of mine who are also scholars of Nietzsche, and it seems to me that Nietzsche is attempting to so first of all, I just want to clarify, Nietzsche is not a reductionist. He's not a materialist. So he actually criticizes scientific positivism, which for the listeners is essentially this idea that everything that we need to understand philosophically can be explained through the material, can be explained through science. Nietzsche rejects this the same way that he rejects the old tenets of moral philosophy, which, like Mark points out, were largely based on the various religions of that time. Nietzsche is attempting to go beyond both reductionism and theism to create this sort of new philosophical or moral doctrine, let's say, that's more so based upon an individual's ability to create. So art, actually, and aesthetics sort of becomes the metaphysics of his worldview, and not necessarily metaphysics in the literal sense, but for example, beauty tends to take a almost metaphysical
Do you want to
value
say
to
what you mean
Nietzsche.
by metaphysical for those who aren't versed in philosophical nomenclature?
Sure. So metaphysics would be that which is essentially beyond the material. So, for example, religion, which deals with deities, right? That's something metaphysical. Um, and and on a sort of more colloquial sense, when we talk about metaphysics, for example, I personally would say that I'm very I look at the petty materialism of modernity, right, where we deal with very cheap pleasures and stuff like that. And while my solution to that may not be literally metaphysical, the fact that I'm trying to go beyond
Right,
these
right, right.
these petty material forces, it takes on a metaphysical aesthetic in the sense where it almost feels like I'm fighting a spiritual battle. So
Let me jump in on the materialism
yeah,
because again, listeners might misinterpret it. So when you say materialistic, you don't necessarily mean a sort of a very petty materialist like Andrew Tate, who's like, you should all have a Bugatti. The sort of a lot of like hippie listeners and people say, hey, I'm not
sure,
materialist. I'm not out about the money. I don't want to wear Armani suits, but they still might be materialist in the sense that like, okay, all that exists is stuff. And therefore,
right.
all you have subjectively is pleasure, and that's it really. Sort of hedonism stems from materialism, and even if it's a sort of hippie, I do breath work and cold showers for pleasure, it's still a kind of
Mhm.
materialism.
Well, it's great that you mentioned that because Marxism is materialism, really.
uh,
So what people don't realize, Marxists, of course, reject property and all these things, but they're very hardcore materialists because they believe that the answer to all of humans' woes is getting rid of, this property to materialism. So in reality, they're materialists too. So that's a good thing that you point out. Somebody might say, well, I live very, very meagerly, very minimalist lifestyle. I'm not a materialist. But if you attempt to use pure material as a solution to your problems, whether it's getting rid of all material
yep.
or hoarding
Equality,
material,
everyone's got the same amount of money, like a, I don't know, a Scandinavian who's very like socialist, and everyone should have the same, but their solution to the world is everyone should have the same amount of stuff, or even the
right?
same opportunities, right? Like we should all have good education. There's still a materialist element there. It's not a transcendent philosophy.
Exactly. And this is something the philosopher Julius Evola talks significantly about, is that both Marxism and capitalism in reality are just two different coins of materialism. And going back just a second to Nietzsche again, I think the sort of valuation of art goes beyond this material, because the way I like to, this is a little bit of my own thoughts that I'm going to talk about here as an interpretation of Nietzsche. Um, it's an analogy I like to bring up where the artist, right, he has a brush, colors, right, a canvas. If you just added these things up in a little basket, right, you put them all in a basket, it's not really worth that much. It's just canvas,
Paint,
colors, and a
yeah, it's a bit of
brush,
class,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, you could get a 3-year old. What's he going to do with that? What's the spiritual element to me is that a person with a will towards creating art and molding things from natural material objects into something more beautiful. The painter can turn those petty things into a resultant painting that is greater than the sum of each of its individual parts. This to
Right.
me is almost it's not metaphysical in a literal sense, but in the sense that you have, it doesn't make sense from a math equation standpoint. These things
Yeah,
shouldn't be worth more.
it's to reduce art to simply the canvas and the paint. Or it's a couple of examples for listeners to look at a forest and simply see the economic value of the wood of the forest, and not the fact that it's a British woodland that's an ancient woodland that has mystery and history and tradition. Or to reduce a love affair to exchanges of bodily fluids, or even to dopamine. It's like, yeah, I had sex
Yeah.
with my girlfriend today. I had a dopamine hit, but that's not the actual beautiful experience of lovemaking with someone you care about.
Yeah, and on that topic, I think that there's two types of people. There's people that treat sex as the climax, right? That's what they do it for, and then there's the ones that enjoy the whole experience. That's almost breaking it down from the material to the metaphysical. And like I said, not literally. I'm using metaphysical very colloquially now. But it's, are you living life for these specific fixes, or are you living life for the journey of attaining those fixes? I'm not doing this so that, I like take fighting or martial arts for instance, right? It's not just about having your hand raised. It's also about the sweat and the blood that you're putting in on the canvas. That's also part of the beauty. It's like I live for the processes and the results, but not merely the results.
Let's bring the body in. So a lot of people in the embodiment world that I'm known in really don't understand that Nietzsche was actually the first modern embodiment philosopher. So we could, he was talking about the
Yeah,
body as self, the body as having wisdom. Heidegger after him, this is the philosophical roots of the embodiment world. This is not just abstract, but I mean, it sounds like you're a practitioner. Like if someone said, let's take it right back down to the practical, why do you do martial arts? You don't need to learn to fight. You live in America, just buy a gun. You don't need to learn combat
sure.
sports. Yeah, it's fitness, but whatever. What would be your answer to why learn martial arts?
I think it's largely due to, again, the colloquial metaphysical ramifications of learning it. What it has, what effect it has on your psyche. I think that what martial arts does, and if you read Sun and Steel, he literally will break down martial arts and how it's almost a dance of death. It's simulating the past in large part, because when you're practicing fighting against someone, you could very easily apply that lens to a man with a spear, maybe fighting off a wolf that's trying to get into his encampment, right? You're simulating death
There's an
with martial arts.
existential confront. You're talking about Mishima again. Honorable Mishima-san. Japanese writer. They wrote Sun and Steel, this wonderful book, and was a martial. He discovered weightlifting and martial arts after being a sickly boy, and it has an existential confrontation as well as the practical health benefits, right?
Precisely, and that's why I think martial arts is so beautiful, because it really teaches you how much pain you can go through. First of all, when you realize how much pain you can go through, that you also find out how much pleasure you can experience.
Way
um,
further than people think. And the Japanese, I love the Japanese. The Japanese are unreasonable. Like they
yes.
take you to a place you didn't even know existed. It's like so much further than you could get away with in a British educational system. Even it's beyond the reasonable.
Right. And one of the things I think is so fascinating is that people think that Japanese are just this boring sort of blank-faced people, but it's so not true. Beyond the or below the mask, behind the mask, there's so much feeling and there's so much emotion. It's just that they express it differently, because obviously it's the cultural value of having that cold mask on the
This is
outside.
also true of the British. I have an Italian girlfriend, and we always say she expresses but doesn't feel, and I feel but don't express. So that's a big difference. And I know you have some Russian blood too, sir, right? And
Yeah.
the Russians have a big heart. They feel very deeply, but their face may be
Hmm.
quite blank.
It's the vodka face.
Do you mind if I ask who are your tribe? What's your ethnicity? You got an Irish name. You look like you've got some Asian in you, and you've got some Russian
Yeah.
in you. A bit of a mix, huh?
Yeah, so let's see. I could break down almost every. So I have so my father's side, my European side, largely Irish, Welsh, Scottish. That's like about a third of his contribution, and then a good bit of Scandinavian. Actually, what's interesting is the Russian side is very little Russian. It's actually much more Scandinavian, because, of course, well, not modern, but let's say that the recent Russian aristocracy largely begin with the people who came with Rurik and the Kievan Rus coming into Ukraine,
Uh-huh,
right,
uh-huh.
from Scandinavia. So ethnically, much of the Russian aristocracy is actually Scandinavian. So, I was looking at my aunt's, 23andMe, maybe not exactly that
Yeah,
website,
yeah,
but,
yeah.
her ancestry. And, I was surprised to see that the actual Russian itself, like Slavic Russian, was actually quite small in comparison to Scandinavian,
Right.
because the aristocracy, largely came from the Vikings. But yeah, so my European side, that's all that. And then on my mother's side, I have predominantly Filipino, a little bit of Chinese, and then some Portuguese and Spanish.
You're a good man. I just left my heating on here, so I had to take my jumper off. I'm
No
not. I'm
worries.
not stripping. We're not getting that. We're not getting that, Mishimik. It's
We're getting very Greek pilled now.
we're getting Greek pilled. Yeah, Bishop will also have
Yeah.
a homosexual side, so there's that's in there. Actually, I mean, let's talk aesthetics, right? So
Yeah.
the modern world is ugly. Everything built in
Hmm.
England since 1945 is disgusting, more or less. There's very little beauty in the architecture, though the thousand-year-old church over there, you can't see it, is absolutely gorgeous. There's a
Hmm.
beautiful history here. And the idea of men being interested in aesthetics, we see that almost as feminine somehow, like it's women who should
Yeah.
be interested in aesthetics. But young guys now, they're in the gym, and part of why they're there is strength and personal growth and Nietzsche and will to power, but part of it's aesthetics, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I always tell people I don't work out to be healthy. Well, not saying you shouldn't work out to be healthy, but me personally, I don't work out to be healthy. I work out because I want to become beautiful, right? I want to attain this certain aesthetic, right? That other people may not be willing to do. I'm willing to sacrifice my health a little bit, because realistically, bodybuilding is not the healthiest,
No, I'm carrying more weight.
exercise.
I'm carrying more weight than is healthy at 45, just in
Right.
muscle, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's not a heart attack risk quite, but it's probably
It's
healthier
getting
when you're
there,
skinnier. Yeah, yeah.
Right. So it's not. I mean, even like the Greeks, right? They were very lean and cut, but even they had a different sort of aesthetic value than we're kind of having today. And I think you know there's different general aesthetic values. There always has to be some utility to it. You have to be strong. If you're
Yeah,
just
yeah.
if
Can
you
you
just
fight? Can you run? This
yeah,
basic stuff,
yeah.
right?
Even Arnold needs to be able to fight, right?
Yeah.
but the problem with a lot of masculinity today is precisely what you're talking about. Masculinity was very tied to art for most of human history. In fact, if you go back to the Greek times, even in plays, right, the female roles were still played by men, right? And this is true in a lot
Shakespeare,
of
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Shakespeare, in Japanese, I believe, no, they had men
Hmm.
who played the female roles. So masculinity was very tied to the arts for most of human history. And I think that large part why you see a lot of cultural decline today is because we don't teach young men about the masculine expression of art. Now it's all just sort of, oh, you're in touch with your feelings and stuff like that, rather than, you should be in touch with your feelings, but instead of the feelings that bring you down, why not the feelings that bring you up? And this is why Nietzsche, loved orchestra so much. There was this sort of biological feeling that you got a chemical reaction from an orchestra, which brought you up. You just felt powerful.
Wagner's a good pre-workout, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, I actually just learned to play. I just learned to play Elsa's Procession on the piano. So
Do you think a
I've
man
been.
should be able to be, a man should be well danced, well read, a man should be beautiful? I regard, I actually regard it as a moral duty to not be ugly. To how you,
Oh yeah,
I mean, my Italian girlfriend won't let me leave the house unless I'm well dressed. She's very Italian. She'll just be like, go back in the room.
yeah,
Like that's a moral duty in Italy that I've taken on. And aesthetically, of course, we're all different. I'm short, somebody
sure.
else is bigger, different physique, whatever. But it's like, there we within what we're given, I think there is a moral duty to
You
aesthetics.
have to maximize it.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I want to be a gift to my girlfriend. I want to be a gift to the young men I work with. I want to be a gift, to different people, and part of that is aesthetics, right?
no, absolutely. And I think it's what when people ask me what the meaning of life is, I think the meaning of life is to beautify the world. And this is the sort of Nietzschean, valuation. Of course, because he never finished Will to Power, it's not so explicitly said.
Yeah.
But I think beautification of the world is the meaning of life, making life more beautiful. What I feel jealous when I watch a really good movie or listen to a really good song or read a really good book because I want to be the guy who can make people feel that
Oh
way.
God, I read T.S. Eliot the other day. I read The Hollow Man, and it was so good. I like loved and hated him completely. I couldn't write for like a full day after reading it. It was so disgustingly good. And it was like,
Uh,
wow, this guy's been dead for quite a while. T.S. Eliot's like, Anglo-American poet that, a lot of people
yeah.
study the wasteland. But it's like, okay, this is a transcendent thing. This is something, I'm watching this The Gorge, which is like a trashy science fiction action love movie about two snipers with across a gorge full
Hmm.
of zombies, and they're referencing T.S. Eliot like 100 years
Uh-huh.
later. And I'm like, wow, even like trashy Hollywood films are referencing this guy. It's like there's some immortality there.
Oh, well, I mean, I think absolutely there's an immortality and I mean, what I was thinking about this the other day. In large part, right? I was talking to my cousin about this. I was kind of joking, but then I realized it was kind of true. I said, how people will say Achilles is real, you are not.
Nice. Say to
Yeah,
people that don't know that, like that's why no one will remember your name, right? Like
yeah,
it's
stuff like that.
uh,
Well, Achilles, he could have. even in the Iliad, he could have stayed in Ithaca and lived a long life, but he chose to go to Troy for glory in the young death, and to be remembered forever. And I would like to think that both you and I are such people that perhaps we will be remembered after we die.
Maybe in small
But
ways. But a little
sure.
example of that. When I was doing this big event called the Embodiment Conference, I had to borrow $2 million to do it. And this was terrifying because no one in my family had ever done that before. And I was scared. I could feel it in my body for
Mhm.
months. We didn't make the money back till the last day of the event. And someone said to me, "Oh, I could never borrow that much money." And I'm
Yeah.
like, "Yeah, and that's why you'll never do anything great."
Mm.
And they were devastated by that.
Yeah.
And people used to ask me what my job was, and I used to say, well, my job's being able to sleep at night when I'm $2 million in debt. And there's someone else listening
Yeah.
to this in Austin who's like, 2 million, that's nothing, I borrowed 2 billion. There's another level that's way above
Sure.
me. I want to be humble here. There's a whole nother level, right? But unless we can
Mhm.
sacrifice, risk it, then yeah, there's an immortality that we will miss.
Absolutely. And the whole, the meaning of the quote, Achilles is real and you are not. Like I said, I'd like to think that at the end of our lives, perhaps we won't be forgotten. But for the average person, right? In 100 years, people know who Achilles was, but nobody's going to know who John Smith was, who spent his life, doing the bare minimum, going to a 9 to 5, and maybe he had 2.5 kids, and then he died, and maybe his
Okay,
kids
let me
remember
play
him and his
devil's
grandkids.
advocate. Someone says, "Hey,
Yeah.
but we believe in equality, and why do you want to be special? And why does glory matter to you? It's very egoic and arrogant and old-fashioned. Like,
Mhm.
what's wrong with being John Smith?
I'd say that there's nothing. We need John Smiths,
Good
obviously.
peasants. I
Most.
like good peasants."
Well, I mean, in reality, right? We can't just have leaders and we can't just have visionaries, because the John Smiths are important to the vision of great men. And the way that John Smiths are remembered, for example, they're remembered through the highways that the beautiful highways we build across our countries. They're remembered by the British Empire. If they say the British Empire lasted for, well, I guess if you go back to William the Conqueror, if you consider, well, all right, I don't know when you'll consider the beginning of the
Listen, as
British Empire. Let's say
someone
this.
in a temporarily divorced colony, tread carefully now because America will be British again. Make America British again is my personal campaign.
Oh
So,
my. Well, just for the analogy, let's say
got
the
it.
16th century,
Got it.
right, is when the British Empire started. So 500 years of the British Empire. John Smith is remembered by saying the British Empire lasted for 500 years. Maybe it'll be longer soon, but just for the
For now,
analogy,
for now.
right? John Smith is the British Empire. That's
Right.
how he's remembered. But then the Duke of Wellington is remembered as the Duke of Wellington, right? Some
Yeah.
people will be remembered by name, but others will be remembered by the deeds, the small deeds that they contributed to the larger body.
Yeah,
So the
being
Roman
a good
Empire.
dad, the table I'm built on, the
Yeah,
table I'm talking to you on now, this table was built by an unnamed craftsman, but there's still honor in that. There's still nobility. And
absolutely.
Evola said it's better to be a good farmer than a bad aristocrat.
Absolutely, because, not, I mean, the good aristocrat can't be a good aristocrat without the good farmer. Think about the hundreds of thousands of legionaries that are forgotten, who built Rome, who made Rome what it is. Their names are remembered in the name of Rome. Not everyone will have their name remembered as the individual name. Not everyone will be Caesar, but
And
everybody will be represented somehow.
you wouldn't necessarily want to be as well. Like I've had some very good assistants, PAs, like what I'd call like number two people. There's often like someone behind the leader who's a good second, behind the
Yeah,
captain. And often I talk to them and say, "Hey, do you want me to help you found your own company? I appreciate that you might want to do your own thing eventually." And some do. Some they're like apprentices. And
yeah,
others they're like, "Oh no, 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 I'm fine being your PA." Like I get a just to give a really concrete example, there's someone that works for me that gets a steady salary and they get their £3,000 a month, steady salary.
yeah,
I get 0 or 6,000 depending on
yeah.
the month, right? So it's
Right.
it's like they're like, I'm happy with my 3,000. I'm happy I don't have people abusing me in the YouTube comments. I'm happy I'm not getting cancelled online. They're quite happy with their 3,000 a month. So that is a perfectly legitimate decision.
Right. No, absolutely. And I understand it. I guess that it comes down to this sort of uh, it's almost this anxiety. So for me personally, maybe you can resonate with this. I feel an anxiety if I'm not trying to be more. I've always hated being, second fiddle. And not to say that throughout my life, I've been led many times in the military and even afterwards sometimes. And I always, will gladly
Sure,
support a
sure.
good leader. But I've always wanted to be more than just the guy at the bottom who makes the first level of the pyramid. I always wanted to get as high in the pyramid as possible. And whenever I wasn't actively trying, I always feel great anxiety
And also, that's
in
your
not trying.
potential, right? I think a sacred
Yeah.
idea in the West, and Peterson talks about this, is potential. Like, is an oak better than an acorn? Well, in a way, because it's more developed. It's reached, an oak is more of its potential than an acorn,
Hmm.
right? It might not be morally better, but it's kind of a pity if an acorn doesn't become an oak, right? And I've
Right.
always wanted to go, I don't think I'm the most intelligent guy, but I've got some intelligence, I've got some talents, and I've got, how fucking far can this thing go? Like,
Yeah.
what's the limit here? And that's, by the way, you're young, but you haven't found this yet. In middle age, you find that limit,
Hmm.
and that's
Interesting.
devastating, because when you could be anything. You're a smart, young, strong guy. You have so much potential. I probably couldn't be anything. I know I've done some shit. Like, I've won a few battles for humanity. I've written a few books, done a couple of cool projects. I can be proud. But if I died tomorrow, I'd still be like, yeah, there's a few things I can hang my coat on. But my
Hmm.
potential is not infinite.
Right.
Under 30, your potential is infinite. So
Yeah.
this is the more, sorry to be an old man, but this is the sort of
No,
the
no.
grief of middle age, brother. The grief of middle age.
Well, I mean, I even think about that sometimes. I wrote one of my essays for one of my classes that I'm taking. It was the struggle of the artist, and the struggle of the artist is that you'll never be as good as you want to be.
Oh,
Your ambitions will always be further than your artistic ability, and I that's a big fear I have. Of course, I wrote my book and I'm happy with it, but I hope that's not the best writing I'll ever
no,
put
you're not
out. You know what I mean?
satisfied. May I never be
Yeah,
satisfied.
never
Like,
be satisfied.
being an artist is like being spiritually greedy. You're like, just
Yes.
never. There's always something else, right? There's always more.
And this is what's so fascinating about, just to go back to the samurai, for instance. So Mishima says the samurai is the total human being, right? He's not somebody who has a trade. He's not somebody who's a really good computer programmer. He's the Renaissance man. He's the fighter and the dancer and the poet. And in the Hagakure, which is perhaps the most important manual for the samurai, they said seek perfection your whole life long, knowing you will never be perfect. And I
Oh,
think that's the artist's struggle, and that's the artist's life. You're always seeking to create art that is perfect, but you're never going to do it. And I think
Kaizen,
what's
yeah, continuous improvement. That's very Japanese. Even today in
oh
corporate
yeah,
world, they still have the Japanese, like, it's good, but it could be they could polish it just 1% better. It's very Japanese.
such spiritual people, because even when it comes to very minute jobs, I saw this guy. I always love to tell the story when I'm talking about the Japanese. He makes ramen for vending machines.
Okay,
So
yeah,
simple, but he wakes up early in the morning to make the perfect ramen. He gets it all together. He makes sure it's nice and hot so it stays as hot as possible. The vending machine, I think, has like a little heating section so you get it warm. But that's he dedicates his life to making the perfect
yeah,
vending machine ramen. And there's something so beautiful in that. It seems so asinine to us in the West, like who cares?
yeah.
But that's his life for him,
But
and that's spiritual.
have you seen Jiro Dreams of Sushi?
Oh my god, such a great movie.
That,
Same thing, except
same
that's on
thing.
a higher scale,
Yeah, he's a
right?
sushi
But
chef, Michelin star sushi chef. Great. If you want to see, I mean, my Japanese martial arts teachers were like this, and even in like our coaching courses, I'm like, okay, I know we're good. I know 200 people on the course, and we've done it for 10 years. Let's make it 10% better this year. Okay, how can we
yes.
make it? So this year, I don't know, we printed out a booklet, because even though it's online, I'm like, okay, let's do something physical. So, okay, that's going to cost this much money. Okay, so we got to make more money to make that better. And there's a polishing in that, which is satisfaction. Let's go back before we finish to aristocracy. So this idea, bear in mind, I'm in England, right? So a few miles
Yes.
away, there are literal land-owning aristocrats who have like a mansion,
Right.
and this is a real thing here. Like, I think it's 90% of the British countryside is actually owned by descendants of William the Conqueror, who was
Oh wow.
yeah, this is like 1,000 years ago, but they still own the land.
Yeah.
So there are real aristocrats here, and they're not very admirable. They're kind of pathetic. They're kind
Right.
of pathetic on the whole. They are physically
Mhm.
bigger, because we used to play them at sports, and when a state school plays a fee-paying school, you lose every time, because the kids are a
Hmm.
couple of inches taller in the fee. But like, there's
Sure.
still the genetics there, right? That's not diet,
Yeah.
that's genetics. Um, So I've got kind of a bit of class hatred and some British stuff mixed in here. But what does this idea mean? It sounds so old fashioned. How can you be talking about aristocracy in 2025?
Yeah, well, of course, the original sort of feudal aristocracy is never going to come back because it's all based on this sort of agrarian, parasitically living off of the peasant class. It's not going to exist like that anymore, and probably for the best. Many historians will actually explore the. We talked about this Uber Boyo, my last podcast, where one of the issues of being an aristocrat who's living parasitically off the peasant class is you have no reason to innovate because they're
Mm.
always going to give you your yields that you need, and so on and so forth. Like I said, stressors. You need stressors in life. In the past, the aristocracy was made hard and made noble because the stresses of other aristocracies that were trying to take them out. That's why they were these big, burly, great
Yeah, because
warriors.
they had the French knights were going to come across the channel and kill you. I mean, I just watched
Exactly.
The King, great film last
Oh, great
night,
movie.
and it's
Yeah.
Make it England, and it's like, yeah, they as a teenager, he had to like fight a duel for
Yeah.
his life. This is not a small thing.
And that's what made them, that's what polished them like marble. I mean, look at Henry V. I believe what he
Yeah,
was 15 maybe when he began the crown. I think even before he became king, he had an arrow in his eye, and they had to like screw it out somehow. This is why they were great. And of course, in modernity, without those stressors, that aristocracy is gone. But a new aristocracy can emerge, and I think it's an aristocracy largely of artists, really, and not
really.
just artists.
What, and you
Yeah,
don't
I
think
think
it's like
so.
a sort of autistic tech aristocracy? That seems to be the
Well,
people who own most stuff.
but that's part of art to me. Art is
Okay,
not regulated to
okay.
just canvases and paintings. I mean, in many ways, a guy like Musk is an artist. I mean, how is SpaceX not art, right? Like the great rocket ships. That is artistic to me because art is simply an expression of the inner will and wanting to transport ourselves to other planets. What could be a greater expression of the human will, the Faustian will, than to allow us to limitlessly expand, right?
I
Until
look
the end of
forward to
entropy.
fighting his robots. That is
Absolutely.
a glorious death fighting Elon Musk's robots. That's if I
or,
ever start to become
or
too old, just feed me to the robot
sure.
army.
Or what if you become like a cyborg robot? Maybe you have to lose a couple of your arms, but then you're just sort of this. Anyway,
Well, actually, I mean,
who
joking
knows?
aside, that's already the case in
Yeah.
Ukraine. Limb loss is a big deal in Ukraine just because of the
Hmm.
war. And some of the
Right.
soldiers have replaced limbs with better than functional limbs. Does this make sense?
Wow.
So imagine you have
Yeah.
you get your legs blown off, and you'd think, oh, I'd
Hmm.
quite like to be able to walk again. Oh no, you don't understand. Some of the new legs
Yeah.
means these soldiers can run at thousands of miles an hour, not thousands, hundreds of miles an hour.
Right.
Like there's a technology that makes them enhanced super soldiers, which
Right.
is fucking crazy because it's like, okay, if they're giving it to soldiers who get their limbs blown off tragically, just through no fault of their own. What about if
Yeah.
a soldier says, okay, I want this? My buddies have
Right.
all got the robot legs. They can all carry twice as much ammunition as I can. Take my legs. This is some Warhammer
Yeah.
40K shit at this point, right? This is,
Awesome.
the
Yeah.
AdMech. This is, I'm gonna geek out a little bit here. This is a science fiction reference.
Yeah, no, well, we'll see specifically on that end, but I when I say that the future is going to be led by artists, what I mean is it's people who aren't going to be confined to this petty sort of I need to make all this money
Uh,
so I can live a comfortable lifestyle. It's people who want to express their will totally, and you do that by doing things that aren't just for these. It's not to gain comfort; it's to gain some sort of higher euphoria that you can only get from doing things that sort of go beyond the scope of what we think is possible. So SpaceX, we're going to go to Mars, we're going to go colonize, uh, we're going to go colonize space. That's one of the things Spengler probably didn't really think about is that he said the end of the Faustian West was largely because, we've discovered everything in the
okay, so
world. There
this
is no
is
more colonies.
Oswald Spengler, historian, said that the West would expand outwards, but then would run out of space because he didn't
Right.
understand that there's three dimensions, right? He was looking at a
Sure.
two-dimensional map. Yeah.
Right. So like, well, the next Faustian uh, exploration is about to begin. We're going to have literally, uh, I mean, eventually with technological singularity, maybe you also end the Faustian age. But that's so far in the future. We have so much that we can explore probably pretty soon, which is going to reinvigorate the sort of Faustian spirit of expansion,
And it is
I
wild.
think.
Like I've expanded in a way I couldn't have imagined, right? Like I didn't even, well, obviously when I was young, I didn't know what a podcast was because it didn't exist. And, you know, this
Yeah,
podcast has had over 3 million downloads, 3.1, I think. That's insane. Or
yeah,
I released a YouTube video last night on the coming British Civil War. And in less than 24 hours, 10,000 people have seen that video, just from
yeah,
the stats, and it's barely started yet. It will hit 100K easily, and I'm just
yeah,
like 10. Like so today, forget about my books and everything else. 10,000 people saw a 90-minute lecture that I recorded 2 days ago. That's
yeah.
a level of opportunity my peasant potato eating fisherman Irish granddad could not have dreamed of.
Right.
Wow, what a time to be alive!
I agree.
So it's the
That's
most
why I don't black pill.
That's why you don't black pill. So black pill is this
Yeah.
like depressive idea, right? So on the one hand, we live in this time of decadence and mental health and drugs, but on the other hand, we live in this time of, you know, maybe I'm not Elon Musk, right? But there's some, I'm kind of glad about that. But there's some possibility for young men today.
Well, more than possibility, I think it's easier. David Goggins says everybody's so mediocre today.
Yes!
That's going to be easier for you. You know,
I'm like, really? Like, I said to my girlfriend, "Why do you find me attractive?" She said, "Have you seen the competition?" I said, "It's not very charming, but I see your point." You know, so
yeah. No, this is our time.
nice. This is a good place to start to wrap up. So,
Yeah.
people can check out the book, right? Promethean Dreams,
Yes, sir.
dystopian. Let's see, what have we got about it? So, I've heard a dystopian novel that explores the themes of alienation, decadence, and the search for meaning in a dehumanized, hypermodern world. Did ChatGPT get the summary right?
That was pretty good. I'm impressed. Yeah, AI is getting better, I
It's getting
guess.
better. It's getting better. I hate to say it, but it is getting better.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. And where do people find you? Tell us about your YouTube channel. I've been a fan for a while. Like, you know, it's regular kind of download for me. So tell people about that.
Yeah, so on YouTube, I go by the Warrior Philosopher. I'm also on Twitter. Um, yeah, YouTube and Twitter are my main things. And like Mark mentioned, I have my new book that just came out, Promethean Dreams. Maybe I'll send you a link somewhere to put down. But if you just look up Promethean Dreams, you'll find it on Amazon. And hopefully some of you guys are interested in it and enjoy it. And if you don't enjoy it, let me know because I'm trying to get better. So check
Nice.
it out, though.
This is great. Good stuff. I think the kids are okay. Actually feel like there's young men like you and Uber Boyo and other people around who are doing great stuff. I'm really impressed with you guys. I really feel a lot of hope for the future. So, you know, in Nietzsche's words, let's have a Dankeschön, or in Mishima, Domo, arigato, gozaimashita. So